Are we ready? We'll start. Well, thank you for coming this afternoon, and on behalf of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, we are delighted to be chairing this conversation today about how to keep justice in the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETPs. JETPs, which are agreements that the U.S. and its partners, its allies, but I think pioneered to some extent by the U.S., have reached with a number of countries: South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and moving forward to some other countries. And they are very innovative and promising new ways, new structure for approaching climate finance, I think it's fair to say. Innovative in the sense that the donors don't do this individually as countries, they're in a partnership to do it together. Even though the financing may be bilateral with the donee country, it's a partnership in which the donors cooperate. They're focused largely on countries that have major coal facilities to try to phase out coal and therefore make major improvements in CO2 emissions, but they're not entirely focused on coal initially and phasing out coal, but not entirely. And they involve the donee country, the country that is trying to go through the transition, developing its own plan. So it's top down with the funding commitments, but bottom up from the point of view of the donee. And it means that the country receiving the money really has to develop itself an economic plan, an investment plan, focused on coal phase out, but not entirely. So it's really a comprehensive sustainability decarbonization plan to match the funding. So you can see that from the point of view of, let's say, South Africa, the questions are really now, when the agreement has been reached, and the country has really made a commitment. In the case of South Africa, the sustainability plan has just been approved by the legislature. That's a big deal. That's a huge commitment. But from the donee country's point of view, the issue is, will the partners really work together here or separately? And will the money be available? Particularly, will it be possible to mobilize the private funding that's necessary for this? From the funder's point of view, the question is, of course, first, will the policy changes that are inherent in this economic plan actually be realized? Because that's a condition of actually moving forward with decarbonization. So then that leaves the question of who is going to make sure that the justice and equity parts of the JETP remain in the plan and become implemented and realized. And that's really the obligation of both parties, of course, both sides, and will be terribly important because these are brand new animals. They're the very sophisticated way of approaching and complicated way of approaching changing a country's whole economy. So these plans are not going to move with lightning speed. They're not going to move linearly. There are going to be setbacks, and so during that time, to keep the commitment of both the donors and the donees populace, how do you make sure that people will believe that the justice commitment is really going to be honored when the action starts to roll? So that's the question we want to address today. And I'm going to introduce quickly our four speakers, and then hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of conversation and maybe even questions. Lyda Fitz is Director of Sustainable Infrastructure Office at the U.S. Treasury Department. She has a very long history of experience at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, deep expertise in sub-Saharan Africa, deep expertise in China, and has been worked at State, the World Bank, USAID. She's been very, very involved in the whole JETP process from the beginning. Joanne Yawich, whom I'm going to ask to talk first, from South Africa, because she has to leave a little bit before the end, is the CEO of, and has been for a while, the CEO of the National Business Initiative in South Africa, but perhaps more important for this panelist program, she's a member of the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa, which is a key body which helped design and promote the economic plan, and as a supervisor, continues to be a very important element in whether this plan gets enacted. And also a member of the National Planning Commission. She has a history of working for the environmental agencies in South Africa, and also the sustainability of land and national parks. I'm very happy to see. Jesse Buendia is the Vice President of Sustainability and National Director for Sustainability for Dream.org. She has, among other things, been long involved with California's Strategic Council on Growth, Strategic Growth Council, which sounds a little bureaucratic, but it means that she's had a sort of been in the cockpit of the sustainability efforts for the world's about to be fourth largest economy for quite a number of years. So she has a bit of a global view about the issue of ethics and justice. And finally, Ariel Ezraki, who's also a fellow, visiting, or not a resident fellow, but a fellow of the Atlantic Council, senior fellow, is director of climate strategy for a company called Nuvest. Very interesting new company in designing, among other things, about to announce a fund that would look at how to invest in private equity firms that are doing sustainable and climate action together. And I won't go into he's a lawyer, a long background in development, particularly in the Middle East, very involved in the huge project to get gas for Gaza project. He is really looking at how to, in effect, also how to mobilize the kind of private investment that's needed for these JETPs. So, Joanne, I'll ask you to go first and talk a little bit from the point of view of South Africa. How are we doing on the South Africa JETP, and particularly the justice portion?
Okay, and afternoon, everybody, and my apologies for having to leave early. So I currently head up the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit, which is in the presidency in South Africa. And since the partnership was signed with the International Partners Group, it is just over 2 years, and in those 2 years we produced an investment plan, and the investment plan looks at South Africa's the scale of need in terms of the finances that would be necessary for us to achieve our nationally determined contribution, and to be able to push our emissions down onto a 1.5 degree compatible pathway if we reach the bottom of the range that our NDC is. And the partnership is really based on supporting the country in order to be able to do that. So the investment plan is a $98 billion investment plan. The partnership with the International Partners Group originally had pledges of around $8.5 billion on the table. That has now, over the last 2 years, grown to around $11.5 billion. And I think importantly, the grant component of that package has gone up from around $500 million to around $700 million. And the grant component is really critical in supporting the just element. in South Africa is a noisy democracy. People demand to be heard, and if they aren't, you hear very clearly about their dissatisfaction in relation to that. We have a cabinet-approved just transition framework in South Africa that really looks at three kinds of justice. It says that in order for the transition to be just, it has to address procedural justice. In other words, people need to be consulted, they need to be heard, they need to have an opportunity to participate. And then it looks at distributive justice and restorative justice. And restorative justice is really around ensuring that people who might be negatively affected by the transition are put back into the position that they were in, so that they are restored or they get new opportunities created. And distributive justice really looks about how do you spread the social benefit of the transition in order to bring in people who would otherwise be left out, including in our country, very importantly, a very large proportion of the youth in the country who have very little opportunities, in a country where you have very high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So that framework is embedded in our investment plan. It is embedded in what we've now produced, which is an implementation plan for the investment plan. And that was done through an enormous amount of consultation with a very wide cross-section of society: business, labor, civil society, faith-based organizations, women's groups, as well as all of the experts who work in the sectors that we are looking at investments happening. And I think importantly, we have one example in South Africa of a coal closure where those just elements didn't happen well enough. And the dissatisfaction of the communities and the problems that they face, I think, has taught us an important lesson around the way we need to address coal closure. And in essence, what our approach going forward is to say that the first thing you have to do is to put in place the community level interventions, the socio-economic support, the enterprise development interventions that start, as well as the repurposing and repowering, so the investment in clean energy, in order that by the time that you actually switch off a coal plant or you decommission, that you have created a new economic ecosystem in a particular region, in order that people aren't left stranded. Because what happened in the area where it didn't work very well was that the workers in the power plant didn't lose their jobs. They were all redeployed to other power stations. But the people who supported that coal plant, including people working in the informal sector, selling food, the people who did maintenance at the power plant, a very big kind of small industry ecosystem, was left without any economic activity, and it's caused huge problems in that community, including big problems with things like gender-based violence. So I think that's the important learning. In terms of financing I think we really are looking at things like the grants, using the grant funding element of these packages very well. We're looking at working with the philanthropy sector. We're looking at the impact investing community. We are looking at the corporate sector as a very important contributor to socio-economic developments and to justice. So I think let me leave it at that. This is not an easy path to walk, and I'm sure we're going to find lots more lessons. But I think in the last 2 years alone, it's been a very interesting and important learning experience to be able to understand a bit of what a just transition is really going to take. My very last point, in other countries of the world, and in particular in the developed world where there have been coal closures, they've happened over a very long period of time. And our German colleagues in particular keep on pointing out to us the length of time that it took them, the money that they needed to invest, and the challenges that they experienced along the way. And I think we're trying to condense this into a much shorter time frame, and being able to learn those lessons and keep that justice alive is very critical. Thanks.
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you very much. Just a note, in the case of both Eastern Europe and Germany, as you said, the time horizon originally for phase out in Germany, for example, 2038, meant that many of the workers were going to retire anyway, or were going to be retrained. But when you try to compress this, the cost goes up not unlinearly. So that's a real challenge. Lyda, please, over to you.
Thanks, George, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting me. I really have appreciated all the work that you were doing to dig into the transition. I think that from the U.S. perspective, when we started to work on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETPs, it was very important that J, the first letter, was at the heart of that design. And that these transitions must be just and equitable for all the communities involved. It's clear in some markets than others, but always true, that there is tremendous economic opportunity in the transition. However, there's a temporal issue of when jobs are come off and when jobs come on, and certainly there are millions of people in our JETP partner countries who depend on fossil fuels for their incomes and livelihoods. So the U.S. faced similar issues in our transition, and so we understand how difficult it can be, and how many embedded interests and real economic livelihoods are at stake. And so it's important, really essential, that coal-centered communities are core to the planning and the strategies of how we move forward. So we are working very much across all of our JETP partnerships with affected communities to ensure benefits from the transition are felt there, as well as in communities more focused on the expansion of renewables. And we aim to identify where that support is needed. Both reskilling, retraining, that's certainly a major element. Job creation is particularly important in South Africa, where there was already fairly high rate of employment in these areas, so all the more essential to make sure that those fewer jobs are not made fewer by this transition. And that means including job retraining proposals into a wider agenda that's premised on strengthening social safety nets, expanding local employment, defending labor rights. And I would note that definition of justice goes beyond just coal-impacted communities. If we want a just transition, energy must also remain affordable for the citizens of our partner countries. Local communities must be consulted on development, and the environment must be protected. So jobs are essential, but it's not only about the jobs. And one of the things that we've been hearing from South Africa is, as you bring down a coal plant, it's not enough to think about the jobs in that plant. There are all the jobs of the restaurants that feed those workers, the landlords that rent that housing, et cetera. It's an entire ecosystem, and so you really have to think about the whole community. And I would say that one of the things that's been that's key to the design of JETPs is that the country leads that transition, and you mentioned that, George. What is important in the J differs across different countries. And when we look at how the U.S. has moved through transition, our lessons learned, Germany's model is different. We partner with Indonesia their initial focus is very much on energy affordability versus jobs. And so it's really the country who needs to lead where those priorities are. I think for us, when the South African JETP, Joanne mentioned the growth of grants, and certainly out of that 8.5 billion, the place where we have been able to add grant money, another 45 million, has been exclusively on just acknowledging that that's an area of the transition that's harder to do through private capital. I think that meaningful civil society participation is essential. We are all here because we're interested in a faster transition that is key to climate change. But the process and that consultation is just as essential of hearing from the affected groups and making them part of that planning. And so you've got to balance the speed at which you can possibly move with a sustainable model that takes that into account. And you can't race ahead of the people who are at the center of these work. I think that the individual JETP secretariats, the group that's managing all of these partners and helping to plan transitions, and congratulations to South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam, who all released at COP or just before investment plans that lay out the projects and the planning of these transitions, and also lay out how that transition will be supportive of those communities and supportive of a just transition. Think that in South Africa, the consultations across civil society have been extensive over the past year and born into this 300-plus page document. And similarly in Indonesia have been outreach for stakeholders throughout the process. Hundreds of individual organizations and people have fed into this in addition to a full public consultation period. And so sometimes when we hear concerns about JETPs not moving fast enough, it's often, I think, from the perspective of, we all want the solutions to come as quickly as possible, but I think it absolutely is essential to recognize all the people's interests that have to be fully considered in putting out a strategy that will work beyond just an announcement, but will actually be implemented.
Thank you. I think that perhaps when you both talked about the impacts on the community as a whole are very, very significant. Many people probably in the United States think about coal transition as primarily hitting, adversely impacting the miners, and then a few people run the plants. But in South Africa, in Indonesia, in Eastern Europe, where it's soft coal, the entire community, the coal is taken out of the ground and processed. The entire community has been built up, not just the mine or the plant. The entire community has been built up around this activity, which is going to be phased out. So the impacts are very broad. Jesse.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. My organization, Dream.org, is a U.S.-focused organization that works at the intersection of racial justice, economic justice, and social justice to try to build an inclusive green economy. Why I hope to be helpful in this conversation is really to be thinking about the solidarity movements that occur between communities that are considered disadvantaged within the United States, as well as communities who are considered disadvantaged in other countries, especially the countries we were talking about today. Some of the lessons learned, I think, and building a movement that could actually share across these communities and people, things that are working, things that are not working around the transitions. I'm here to share a few of those case studies. Hoping that, again, that there'll be a much broader impact in us being able to share this with marginalized people across the world. For us in the United States, you've heard now from last year's announcement about the significant investment that the United States is making in climate change with the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is very significant for organizations like mine who have been advocating for the last decade for climate investments to be coming to the United States, but that it should be building a green economy that's for everyone, not just for some. And so what that looks like for us is that we know it's critical to inform policy. We know that procedural justice is at the core of any of the program design that's coming forth. And then the key piece of partnership and leveraging capital to make sure that the public sector dollars are not the only dollars that are available to be able to achieve some of these justice goals. So to describe what that looks like for us right now, in the policy realm, we're really, really happy that the White House was able to take such a strong stance on environmental justice and to make it critical around all of its policy goals, that these investments at the forefront need to be able to, one, recognize the injustice that the previous economy, fossil fuel economy, has created in the United States, and that justice be a measurable set of goals that the government will hold itself to, and that stakeholder communities like ours can actually make the government accountable for. And so most recently, our organization worked very closely on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is the largest funding source within the Inflation Reduction Act, to make sure that disadvantaged communities were the intended beneficiary of those dollars. What's really unique about this funding source is that not only is it intended to serve disadvantaged communities, but it's designed to leverage private funding. And why I think this is really important is that government plays an incredibly important role in setting the standards of what then the private market needs to adjust towards. And so for us, we've been really involved with making sure that financial institutions can take advantage of this particular moment where the government is de-risking these investment opportunities within disadvantaged communities to then bring in the private capital that's going to be needed to sustain these investments in the long haul. The other thing that's really important is procedural justice. And so what's really critical for us is all of the investments need to have a local buy-in, community buy-in. That means stakeholder engagement, technical assistance, the full support of the engaged and impacted communities from the beginning of the design of a investment all the way through the actual investment and then afterwards. And so that's a very long period of time. If you're talking about large plants, or if you're talking about significant clean energy investments, or even affordable housing, all of this takes a lot of different kind of financial capital, and they're projects that take time to build. And so being able to just make sure that people are at the table and fully resourced to be at the table is really important. And then I will say in regards to the partnerships pieces, we are baking into many of our federal government investment plans requirements around community benefit agreements, as well as project labor agreements. And why these legal tools are important is that they hold then investors as well as the new and emerging businesses accountable to making sure that there's negotiated and transparent agreements with the local communities that are impacted. And then what's critical is that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's been mentioned many times, but every community has a different set of priorities. And so what's critical is making sure that the community is deciding what those priorities are, and that we're lifting up and figuring out how to fund those priorities in the long haul. And so these are all the things that we've noticed have been able to work, that we have examples of, that we are very happy to share, again, with movements of other people, disadvantaged people across the world.
Thank you, Ariel.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. I'll say two things. First of all, when I was gathering my thoughts for this session, I was thinking, well, I live in Europe, I live in Germany, and there's a few countries in Europe that also need to be phasing out of coal, but we'll put that aside. That's happening. It's not just in the developing world. It's not just in the global south, obviously. That's one thing. And George, since you mentioned the Gas for Gaza project that I was trying to drive forward for many years, I'll mention an anecdote from that, because when we talk about just transition, I remember when I was trying to raise financing for the project with European partners, or other partners as well, with European partners, at some point, we faced a wall, because I was being told, well, actually, our taxpayers, can't fund gas projects anymore. And I was hearing the same from the IFIs, and was thinking, well, hold on. I mean, that's great, but these guys have an electricity deficit. How are we going to sort that out? So it's great for Europe and other parts of the West to be, moving, clean transition and all the rest of it, but it is a transition, and particularly in the developing context, we need to obviously be mindful of that. Eventually, they found an exception, but it was a long, painful process. Moving on to the climate finance space, obviously a theme that's been explored and discussed at this COP and in others, but has had a lot of attention at this COP, is the challenge of mobilizing private financing, in particular, to the global south. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Better? Done. Great. I'll continue then. So we have a massive challenge of mobilizing private financing to the global south. And I heard earlier on today Deputy Assistant Hochstein from the White House talking about that, and talking about that the biggest challenge in that regard is, for private investors, we need to find a way of de-risking that investment so that becomes a compelling investment for the private markets, for private capital. And I think the announcement coming up about Altera has been very positive. We've also heard other statements come through about ways of supporting the private capital going to the global south. I think that's very important, and there's a clear recognition that's necessary. I'm part of a company, which George mentioned, called Nuvest, and the vision of our founder, Edward Telmorgera, was that we need to find a way of creating better access for private capital around the world. So we decided to establish, in fact, we announced the launch here at COP28 and in Abu Dhabi Finance Week of the world's first investable index of energy transition private funds out of Abu Dhabi as a gateway, really for the rest of the world. And what we'd like to see eventually happening, I mean, we're planning on doing this in Nuvest, but obviously there could be other players who can and should be doing this as well, is creating investment funds, in different countries. By definition, the way we operate is it's a passive index fund. So the idea behind it is that you're already de-risking significantly, and that helps address part of this challenge that we're facing, that private investors are facing.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that for a moment, Ambassador Kerry announced a framework for something that they've been working on now for a year and a half, an energy transition accelerator, to try to figure out whether some of the JETP investments and others can be, private sector money can be mobilized through carbon offsets, industrial carbon offsets, as opposed to offsets that protect against deforestation. And that's a very innovative idea, and potentially a huge idea, but faces lots of challenges. Elsewhere, there's a lot of discussion now about trying to mobilize private capital through the use of guarantees. And I won't advertise it, but we're at the Atlantic Council. We're also been working on a very large $300 billion facility that would use sovereign balance sheets to guarantee investments directly to private investors in emerging markets and developing economies. But let me come back, Joanne, to you before. Tell me though if you have to leave in a minute or two. What do you see? What do you see as probably the biggest single challenge here in the equity and justice part of this program? I mean, looking at the next year or two as it rolls out, what's the biggest hurdle or the biggest challenge to that?
Okay, so look, there are many problems in our country, but I was very struck by a comment that the German climate envoy made yesterday at an event where we looked at the JETP experience. And South Africa is currently in the middle of a really serious energy crisis. We don't have enough power. And it is causing havoc with the economy. We have what we call load shedding, which is rotational blackouts, essentially. And unless we get new capacity onto the grid, and unless we expand the grid in order to be able to do that, the economic outlook for the country as a whole and all of its people is fairly dismal. And what Ryan Nabaka said was that he thought that the biggest injustice that we are facing at the moment is the fact that people don't have power. And so for us, I think it is the provision, the expansion of our grid, the rollout at a very rapid pace of a very ramped up level of renewable energy really is going to be the cheapest and the best way forward in order to be able to, I suppose, create a basis that would allow economies to be revived and the transition to happen in a way that makes sense. So I think that that is actually a very critical issue. And our approach of saying first you've got to do the repurposing, repowering and the community level development, and only then do you decommission is also a response to an energy supply crisis. So you know, I think that we sit between science and equity in a lot of this conversation, and we try to find the balance. And recognizing the realities of the science and recognizing the need of the way our response is structured to ensure that we are creating better futures for people. And I think that the justice sits somewhere in between those two, because if you don't address the issues of the science, if you don't address the climate impacts, if you don't reduce emissions, you sit with a very serious problem. So I think we've got to keep that picture in mind. Thanks.
But it's hard to take out of service plants that will only result in people getting electricity 8 hours a day instead of 12 hours a day, and the price goes up, right? Is that, Lyda, is that as, I know that energy crisis in South Africa, is that as true in Indonesia and Vietnam, or is that a somewhat different situation? And then Joanne, I don't want you to respond to that too when I come back. Lyda, how are they different or aren't they different?
They're very different. Very different. You know, Indonesia has an energy surplus, so it's a different sensitivity. It doesn't make it any less challenging. And I think what's similar is that part of the challenge is in the handoff. You know, as Joanne was saying, you really have to demonstrate the availability of jobs. You really have to demonstrate the availability of power before you start pulling back jobs and power that are existing. And so how do you do that as quickly as you can? In Indonesia, there is also that. You know, how do you pull back on really young coal power plants that have a lot of life left, and building up renewables in a way that in an islanded, very islanded grid, you have to provide stable power across a lot of separate systems. And that is the complexities of both of them are extensive. And I would say that, you know, for Indonesia, it's very much about how do we maintain the tremendous economic growth that we're pursuing. How do we marry the expansion of clean energy value chains with critical minerals in a way that is clean? Because as it turns out, it can be very difficult to mine and process these critical minerals where you find them with renewable energy. So I think that when you think about the biggest challenge, it's like having all of these different pieces come in at the same time across so many different ministries in a government, communities in a country, and bringing them, having that handoff in the way that you have designed it.
So the question I want to ask Jesse is, how different is this in California? Try to see that as long as, hold it down, I guess. I mean, in California, the criticism is that the aggressive greening means that you pay the highest power prices in North America. And that's not good for communities that can't afford to pay those prices. How is that issue resolved? How does the state approach that issue?
Can you hear me all right? Oh, great. Yes, so California has been very ambitious about its climate goals for a long time. And I think for groups that work at the intersection of the three areas I talked about, social justice, economic justice, racial justice, we do actually have to balance the fact that we need affordable energy for us to be able to improve the quality of life of the people most impacted by poverty and pollution. And you need reliable energy, so you need a reliable grid. But we need to also be able to maintain and stay accountable to ambitious climate goals. Two ways that I think, in regards to the earlier question about what are some of the challenges, in the US, a part of it is just, you've mentioned it, the transmission lines. And that is a global problem because it's very expensive. There's a lot of challenges in our permitting process and a lot of challenges in our regulatory frameworks to be able to, again, get the infrastructure in place to reduce energy costs that will carry then the energy load that we're going to need, even with renewables. But I would say the other piece about the building an inclusive economy is that there is a sense that the green economy isn't for everyone, that the green economy has winners, just like power plants had winners, and then the losers are always going to be the same losers. And so I think we have a major narrative change problem, and it's probably similar to what's happening globally, that we need to make sure that the people who have been negatively impacted by the previous economic conditions are actually the winners of the new economic model that we're trying to build. And what that means is we can't always see them as victims. We can't always see them as people who don't have something to bring to the table, somebody even that just needs a job given to you by someone else. I think for our organization, being able to lift up the fact that these are communities that are communities of innovators and communities of people who have solutions, and they know what those solutions are. And given the right amount of technical assistance, community engagement support, ability to be invested in, they could scale these businesses where they're employing their own people. And these stories are actually the ones that capture the imagination, so that as we're building an inclusive green economy, people feel bought into it, and they feel bought into the rapid pace of the transition. And so I would just encourage us to always be thinking about disadvantaged communities, not from the framework of what they don't have, but actually from the framework of what they do have and what they could offer. Not just the communities that they're from, but even the larger global markets.
We only have a minute or two left, and I'm just going to use it to ask Ariel a completely unsignaled question, maybe very unfair. Several people mentioned transmission. Have I heard every day today? Power systems. There will be no transition unless there's transmission.
Yeah.
a huge problem in South Africa, and people don't realize how huge it is in the U.S. Are there patterns of investment? I mean, is there an interest? Is there a way to invest in transmission? I realize each country is different, but you know, you have experience in investing in energy systems across the world. Even in the U.S., hard to find a good model to encourage a lot of private investment in transmission. That may be because our planning and permitting process is so messed up. But just a question about financing transmission. How hard will that be?
I think that's an excellent question. It's important because there was one speaker the other day who was talking about how, you know, we can't only be talking about solar PV panels. You know, we need the grid, we need the transmission, we need to get to the customers, we need to get to... and transmission is obviously a key part of it, and I'm happy you raised it because it brings back the issue of incentives and how do we actually make this something which is economically feasible. I think, first of all, transmission systems are a clear example of private partnerships. That's one. But the other thing I would say is transmission systems, as we know, are also evolving. We're seeing increasingly microgrids, and we're seeing, you know, tech going into it and cybersecurity. So I think, you know, there's a theme that many people have said already in this COP. You know, climate change is happening. It's awful, but it also does create opportunity, and there is a lot of opportunity, including in the transmission space.
I don't know that there's been much pressure for or actual technological advance in transmission, not in the U.S. anyway, in several decades. Now people suddenly are, smart grid was smart, but, you know, more powerful grid. Now people are looking at wires that will carry 75% more power, so you don't have to replace the towers or put in new transmission. So that's certainly an area for scientific, technical advancement as well as investment. I think we're done. My watch says it's 1:15. Thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you in the audience.